As most of my friends and family can attest, I've become very passionate about all things health and nutrition related. Some might even call me borderline obsessive, but that's okay. It all started back in October when I did a 30-day challenge called the Whole 30. Now I know what you're thinking. You're skeptical, just like I was. What's the catch? How much is this going to cost? Am I going to have to drink some weird juice or take some fancy supplement? I became even more skeptical when the program promised that it would change my life. Well, guess what? It did. So much, in fact, that I stand here in front of you today feeling healthier than I've ever felt in my entire life. Heck, my fiance Jessie and I just recently launched a blog about health and nutrition. We're challenging our own family and friends to join us in doing another Whole 30 starting August 1st. You see, since October, I have been relentless at wanting to learn more about health and nutrition. And although I've only been at it for less than a year, I feel as if I've learned some valuable lessons, one of which I'd like to share with you today, and that is that eating fat doesn't make you fat. I've got one goal today that's pretty simple and straightforward, and that is to give you a new perspective on dietary fat. There's a ton of research going on with research scientists and different health communities that are focused on this, so for me to do it all justice in the next 5 minutes would be really tough. But it is my hope that by giving you some of my high-level learnings, I give you just a different perspective on the demonized macronutrient of fat, and I let you leave here today maybe just slightly curious about this whole concept in general. There's an interesting theory associated with the word fat. You see, by definition, fat is both a noun and an adjective. Author Harvey Levenstein wrote it brilliantly. One wonders, what would have happened if the fats in our food and bloodstreams had been called by the scientific name, lipids? Would avoiding the off-putting term fat with its connotation of obesity have mitigated much of the fear of fats in food? Since the 1960s, it's been gospel. Eating fat makes you fat. But is this true? Before we can accept this notion, we need to establish some basic biological principles for what controls fat storage, or more specifically, what in the body, metabolically speaking, is responsible for taking fat and storing it in our fat tissue, and by extension, making us gain weight and get fatter. In a nutshell, the answer is one word: insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's secreted by the pancreas in varying degrees based on what you eat. Carbohydrates secrete insulin to the most degree, then protein, and fat actually doesn't stimulate insulin at all. Insulin's primary role is to regulate the amount of blood sugar in your body at any given point in time. When blood sugar, or glucose, is in the blood, insulin is secreted to go take that glucose out of the blood and store it in the liver or muscles. The caveat here is that we only have a finite amount of room that we can store that glucose in the liver and muscles. If we run out of room, the body's only got one choice, and that choice is to store it as fat. As an example, let's say I were to take down an entire bag of M&Ms, which is my guilty pleasure, I admit. Love M&Ms. If I took down a bag of M&Ms, it would go into my stomach, I would digest it, and it would get broken down into glucose and then released into my bloodstream. At that point, the pancreas would secrete insulin, it would go and grab the sugar from my blood, put it in my liver and muscles, but as I mentioned before, if we don't have room there, the only thing my body can do is store it as fat. I'll borrow an analogy from the two authors that wrote the book, It Starts With Food. Let's say I open this window behind me. What would happen? Well, the Texas heat would start to come in, this room would warm up, and naturally the thermostat would detect this, kick on the AC, and cool the room down, keeping everything in balance. This is exactly what the body does when glucose enters the bloodstream. The point to all of this is that carbohydrate intake, and all carbohydrates eventually get broken down into glucose, whether it's beer, fudge, broccoli, bananas, strawberries, no matter what, it gets broken down into glucose. That then gets released into the blood, the pancreas secretes insulin, and you know the rest of the story. More and more, people are figuring this out. You see, it's not the fat in the diet that causes weight gain. It's the excessive carbohydrate intake that causes weight gain. And people are figuring this out. Some even take it to the extremes, and they adopt what's called a ketogenic diet, which is where you inhibit carbohydrate intake by less than 50 grams per day. Just to give you some context, 1.5 bananas would put you over that mark. That's how few carbohydrates we're talking about. Other diets include the low glycemic index diet, the paleo diet, or the Mediterranean diet. All of these are much higher in fat and lower in carbohydrates, which support weight loss and arguably better overall health. The Center for Disease Control has a program of studies called NHANES, which is an acronym for a long string of words, but the bottom line is that NHANES has a database with some very interesting statistics, one of which I'd like to share before we close. And that is that in 1971, the U.S. obesity rate was 15%. Now, it's 36%. Over that same course of time, we've seen carbohydrate intake steadily increase, while fat intake steadily decrease. Now, I work in revenue management, so I never mistake correlation with causation, but this certainly does give us trends that we can glean insights from. In closing, I'm not recommending that you adopt a certain diet without doing your own research or your own self-experimentation, but what I am recommending is that you start challenging conventional wisdom and you start entertaining the ideas of alternative hypotheses, such as fat doesn't make you fat. I'd be silly to think that we're all going to go out and buy a giant tub of lard and chow down together. Although I will say, 4 days out of the week, I put 3 tablespoons of grass-fed butter into my coffee for breakfast. But I'll save that story for another speech.